Sometimes the people who should love us most are the ones who hurt us deepest. Alice learned this truth when her own family decided she wasn't worth keeping. They called her Barren and traded her away like broken goods to a mountain man named Bram. Everyone expected him to treat her poorly, but Bram surprised them all. He built her a home with his own hands and asked her to be a mother to his 2 children. In the harsh Montana wilderness of 1887, Alice discovered something beautiful. She found that being a mother had nothing to do with giving birth. It was about giving love. This mountain man saw her worth when her own blood couldn't. What happens when kindness comes from the most unexpected place? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Alice's family decided her fate. Frost covered the ground like scattered salt, and her breath formed small clouds in the October air of 1887. She stood in the doorway of the cabin she'd called home for 22 years, clutching her mother's tarnished silver locket, the only thing of value she owned. Inside the locket was a faded photograph of her mother as a young woman, smiling with hope that Alice had never seen in person. Her mother had died when Alice was 12, and with her went any softness in the household. "Alice, come away from that door," her father called from inside, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd made a hard decision and wouldn't be swayed from it. "Standing there won't change what needs doing." Her stepmother, Meredith, sat at the rough wooden table, counting and recounting the few coins they had left. "Dr. Morrison was clear enough," she said without looking up. "Barren is a winter field, no use to any man seeking a proper wife and family. At least this way she'll be fed and housed." Alice's younger half-brother Samuel, barely 16, shifted uncomfortably near the fireplace. He alone had protested their decision, though his voice carried little weight in their desperate household. "Pa, maybe if we just waited until spring..." "Spring won't fill empty bellies or pay what we owe," their father replied, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he reached for his coat. "Mountain Man's got need of someone to tend his children and keep house. Alice gets a roof and food. We get enough to see winter through. It's practical is all. Practical." The word cut through Alice like a blade. She touched the locket at her throat, feeling the worn silver warm under her fingers. Her mother had believed in love, in kindness, in the possibility that life could be more than mere survival. But her mother was gone, and practicality ruled their world now. The sound of heavy hoofbeats broke through the morning stillness. Alice's heart began beating faster as she recognized the rhythm of multiple horses approaching. Through the frosted window, she could see 3 riders emerging from the tree line. The man in front sat his horse with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to both the saddle and the wilderness. Even from a distance, his size was imposing. Broad shoulders beneath a heavy coat, hands that looked capable of both building and breaking. This was Bram Carlyle, the mountain man who would become her husband by arrangement, not affection. Behind him rode Judge Cornelius Hartwell, an older gentleman whose presence lent an air of legality to what might otherwise seem like a simple transaction. The judge had known Alice's family for years and had offered to oversee the arrangement. The third rider was Dr. Morrison, who had pronounced Alice barren after her difficult recovery from a fever 2 years prior, though she sometimes wondered if he'd simply provided her family with the excuse they needed to be rid of an extra mouth to feed. Bram dismounted first, his movements deliberate and careful. He stood nearly 6.5 feet tall, with dark hair that showed traces of early grey and eyes the colour of winter sky. There was something in his face that Alice hadn't expected, a gentleness that seemed at odds with his reputation as a solitary mountain dweller. When he looked toward the cabin, his gaze found hers through the window, and he nodded once, a simple acknowledgement that carried more respect than she'd received from her own family in months. "Alice," her father called again, and this time she obeyed, moving away from the window to gather her few belongings. Everything she owned fit into a single canvas bag: 2 dresses, undergarments, her mother's worn Bible, a few hair ribbons, and the small wooden horse Samuel had carved for her 15th birthday. It seemed a pitiful collection to represent a lifetime, but Alice had learned not to attach herself too deeply to material things. People were temporary enough, possessions even more so. The men entered the cabin, their presence making the small space feel even more cramped. Judge Hartwell removed his hat and nodded politely to Alice. He was a distinguished man in his 60s, with silver hair and eyes that seemed to hold the weight of difficult decisions. Dr. Morrison, thin and nervous, clutched a leather satchel and avoided meeting Alice's gaze directly. Bram stood quietly near the door, his hat in his hands, observing the proceedings with an expression Alice couldn't quite read. When her father began discussing terms, as if she were livestock being sold, rather than a woman being wed, Bram's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "The arrangement is as we discussed," Judge Hartwell said formally. "Miss Alice will become Mrs. Carlyle and will help care for his children and household. In return, her family receives compensation sufficient to see them through the winter months." Alice felt her cheeks burn with shame, but she kept her chin lifted. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break, not when they'd already broken her in every way that mattered. "I've brought something," Bram said suddenly, his voice deeper than Alice had expected, but surprisingly gentle. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small wooden box, carved with simple but elegant designs. "Figured every woman ought to have something pretty on her wedding day." He approached Alice slowly, as if she were a wild creature that might startle and run. When he was close enough, she could smell pine and wood smoke on his clothes, and see that his hands, though large and calloused, were scrupulously clean. He offered her the box with a slight smile that transformed his stern features. "Go ahead," he said softly. "It's yours now." Alice's hands shook slightly as she accepted the box. Inside, nestled in soft fabric, was a simple gold band. Nothing elaborate, but clearly made with care. It was the first gift she'd received since her mother's death, and the thoughtfulness of it brought unexpected tears to her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Seems we should get on with it then," Dr. Morrison said impatiently, consulting his pocket watch. "I've got other calls to make today." Judge Hartwell cleared his throat and opened his legal Bible. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Bram Carlyle and Alice Patterson in holy matrimony. The ceremony was brief and witnessed by people who viewed it as a transaction rather than a celebration. Alice spoke her vows clearly, looking directly into Bram's eyes as she did so. She saw something there that gave her a flicker of hope. Not love, certainly, but respect and perhaps the possibility of kindness. When Judge Hartwell pronounced them husband and wife, Bram gently took Alice's hand and slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if he'd somehow known exactly what size to make it. "Mrs. Carlyle," he said formally, then smiled again. "Alice, ready to see your new home?" As they prepared to leave, Alice hugged Samuel goodbye, whispering to him to take care of himself. Her father shook Bram's hand and pocketed the small leather pouch that sealed their bargain. Her stepmother didn't even look up from her coins. The ride to Bram's mountain homestead took most of the day. Judge Hartwell accompanied them part way before turning toward his own property, but not before speaking privately with Alice as they rested the horses by a creek. "Mrs. Carlyle," he said carefully, "I want you to know that I've watched Bram for many years. He's a good man who's known great loss. His first wife, Margaret, died in childbirth 3 years ago, leaving him with 2 small children. He struggled mightily to care for them alone." Alice listened quietly, grateful for any insight into the man who was now her husband. "I also want you to know," the judge continued, his voice gentler, "that I have some understanding of family disappointment. Sometimes the people who should cherish us most fail in that sacred duty. But sometimes, Alice, we find our true family in unexpected places." There was something in his tone that suggested personal experience with such disappointment, but Alice didn't pry. Instead, she thanked him for his kindness and watched him ride away toward his own lonely house on the valley's edge. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the landscape grew more rugged and beautiful. Pine trees stretched toward a sky so blue it seemed painted, and the air held the crisp promise of the coming winter. Alice found herself breathing more deeply than she had in months, as if the mountain air was washing away some of the hurt that had settled in her chest. "Not much farther now," Bram said, the first words he'd spoken in over an hour. "Children are probably watching for us from the ridge." "Tell me about them," Alice requested, realizing she knew almost nothing about the two young lives she was about to help shape. Bram's entire demeanor softened when he spoke of his children. "Emma's 9, smart as a whip and curious about everything. She's been trying to manage the household since her mother died, but she's too young for such responsibility. Then there's Thomas. He's 6, gentle-hearted but shy around strangers. Both of them have been without a mother's care for too long. What have you told them about me?" "The truth," Bram replied simply. "That you're going to be their new mother, and that I hope you'll all learn to care for each other." Alice appreciated his honesty, even as it heightened her nervousness. Being a wife to a man she barely knew seemed daunting enough, but becoming an instant mother to 2 grieving children felt overwhelming. As they crested a final ridge, Alice caught her first glimpse of what would be her new home. Nestled in a clearing surrounded by towering pines, sat a sturdy log cabin with smoke rising from its chimney. Nearby stood a smaller cabin, newly built from the looks of it, with fresh timber and careful craftsmanship evident in every line. "Built that one for you," Bram said, following her gaze. "Figured you'd want your own space, at least at first. No pressure to share quarters until you're comfortable with the idea." The thoughtfulness of this gesture struck Alice deeply. In all the arrangements and discussions about her future, no one had considered her comfort or preferences. Yet this man she'd known for less than a day had built her an entire cabin, so she wouldn't feel trapped or forced into intimacy. She wasn't ready for 2 small figures emerged from the main cabin and stood watching their approach. Even from a distance, Alice could see their uncertainty and hope warring in their young faces. Her heart went out to them immediately. Children who had lost so much and were now unsure what this new arrangement would mean for their lives. As they rode into the clearing, Alice squared her shoulders and prepared to meet the children who would, if God willed it, become her own. The late afternoon sun slanted through the pine boughs, painting everything in gold and shadow. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Alice allowed herself to hope that her story might have a different ending than the one her family had written for her. "Welcome home, Alice," Bram said quietly as he helped her down from her horse. And something in his voice made her believe that it truly could be. The first week in her new home passed like a careful dance between strangers, learning each other's steps. Alice woke each morning in her small cabin to the sound of Bram splitting wood or tending to the animals, his quiet efficiency a comforting rhythm in the mountain stillness. The children, Emma and Thomas, watched her with the wariness of young creatures who had learned that adults could disappear without warning. Emma, true to her father's description, proved to be both intelligent and guarded. She had been managing far too much for a 9-year-old, cooking simple meals, mending clothes, and trying to mother her younger brother while grieving her own loss. When Alice offered to help with the washing, Emma's first instinct was to refuse. "I can manage it fine," the girl said, her small chin lifted in defiance that reminded Alice painfully of herself. "You've been doing it since Ma died." "I'm sure you have," Alice replied gently, settling beside Emma at the wash basin. "But perhaps we could do it together. I'd like to learn how you prefer things done." It was a small concession, but Emma's rigid shoulders relaxed slightly. They worked in silence for a while, Alice following the child's lead, until Emma finally spoke again. "Pa says you're going to be our new mother now. Your father and I are married, yes, but I understand you already had a mother who loved you very much. I don't want to replace her memory. I just hope in time we might care for each other." Emma considered this seriously, her hands never pausing in their work. "Ma used to sing while she did the washing, said it made the work go faster." Would you like to sing something now?" For the first time, Emma smiled, just a small curve of her lips, but it transformed her solemn face entirely. She began a simple hymn in a clear, sweet voice, and Alice joined in softly. Thomas, who had been playing nearby with wooden blocks his father had carved, crept closer to listen. The moment felt fragile and precious, like holding a butterfly that might fly away at any sudden movement. Alice stored it carefully in her heart, this first small sign that the children might eventually accept her presence in their lives. Thomas proved even more cautious than his sister. The 6-year-old had his father's gentle eyes, but spoke so rarely that Alice wondered if he'd forgotten how to trust his own voice. He followed her at a distance during the day, always staying just out of reach, watching her every movement with solemn intensity. On their 4th evening together, Alice was sitting on the steps of her cabin, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple when Thomas approached slowly. He carried something in his small hands, a rag doll with yarn hair and a dress made from scraps of fabric. "Emma made this for me," he said quietly, holding out the doll. "When I missed Ma too much to sleep, but I thought maybe you might like her." Alice's throat tightened with emotion. "She's beautiful, Thomas." "Did you want to tell me about her?" The little boy settled beside her on the step, still maintaining a careful distance. "Her name is Molly. Ma used to say that when we give something to someone we care about, it carries love with it. Your mother sounds like she was very wise. Do you think she would have liked you?" The question was asked with such innocent seriousness that Alice had to pause to consider her answer carefully. "I hope so, Thomas. I think any mother would want someone kind to help look after her children when she couldn't be there anymore." Thomas nodded gravely and handed her the doll. "You can keep her until you don't need her anymore." That night, Alice placed the little doll on the shelf beside her bed, understanding that she'd been given something far more valuable than a simple toy. She'd been offered a piece of trust from a child who had precious little left to give. By the end of the week, they had settled into a routine that felt almost natural. Alice helped with meals and household tasks, while giving Emma space to maintain her sense of responsibility. She read stories to Thomas in the evenings and listened to his quiet observations about the world around them. Bram worked from dawn to dusk preparing for winter, but in the evenings he would sit with them by the fire, carving small toys or mending harnesses while they talked about the day. It was during one of these peaceful evenings that their fragile new peace was shattered. Alice was reading aloud from a book of fairy tales when the sound of snarling reached them from outside. Bram's head snapped up immediately, his body tensing with sudden alertness. "Stay here," he ordered quietly, reaching for the rifle mounted above the fireplace. "Keep the children away from the windows," but Alice could already hear what had alarmed him, the unmistakable sound of wolves, and they were close, too close. Emma grabbed Thomas and pulled him toward the far corner of the room, while Alice moved to peer carefully through a gap in the shutters. In the moonlight, she could see them clearly. 3 large wolves circling the chicken coop, their eyes gleaming with predatory intent. One had already managed to break through the wooden barrier and was attacking the panicked birds inside. "The chickens," Alice whispered. Those birds represented precious protein for the winter months ahead, eggs that would supplement their diet when fresh meat became scarce. Losing them could mean real hardship for the family. Bram had slipped outside, rifle in hand, but Alice could see immediately that he faced a dilemma. The wolves were positioned such that firing at one would likely send the others scattering toward the main cabin and toward the children she was supposed to protect. Without fully thinking through her actions, Alice grabbed the heavy iron poker from beside the fireplace. "Emma, bar the door behind me and don't open it unless you hear my voice or your father's." "Alice, no," Emma whispered urgently, but Alice was already unlatching the door. She stepped into the cold night air, her heart hammering but her resolve firm. The wolves had noticed Bram's position and were beginning to spread out exactly as she'd feared. But they hadn't yet seen her emerge from the cabin. Moving as quietly as she could, Alice circled toward the chicken coop from the opposite direction. When she was close enough, she raised the iron poker and brought it down hard against a metal bucket, creating a loud clang that echoed across the clearing. The effect was immediate. All three wolves turned toward the unexpected sound, momentarily confused and distracted from their positions. It was exactly the opening Bram needed. His rifle cracked once, then twice in quick succession. Two of the wolves dropped immediately, while the third fled into the darkness with a wounded yelp. Alice stood frozen in the aftermath. The poker still gripped tightly in her hands, adrenaline making her entire body shake. She had acted purely on instinct, driven by a fierce protective urge she hadn't known she possessed. Bram reached her in 3 long strides, his face a mixture of relief, admiration, and exasperation. "That was either very brave or very foolish," he said, gently taking the poker from her trembling hands. "The children," Alice managed. "I couldn't let anything happen to them." Something shifted in Bram's expression as he looked at her, a recognition that went deeper than gratitude. "No," he said quietly. "I don't suppose you could." The cabin door flew open and both children rushed out, Emma first with Thomas close behind. They ran straight to Alice, Emma throwing her arms around Alice's waist while Thomas grabbed her hand. "We were so scared," Emma said, her voice muffled against Alice's dress. "We thought something might happen to you too." Alice knelt down so she could look both children in the eyes. "I'm here," she said firmly. "I'm not going anywhere." The next morning, news of the wolf encounter spread quickly through their small mountain community. When neighbors came to check on them and offer assistance, Alice noticed how they looked at her differently now. She wasn't just the woman who had been traded to the mountain man anymore. She was the woman who had risked her life to protect his children and livestock. Mrs. Patterson, the school teacher who lived in the valley below, sought Alice out specifically. "That took real courage," she said approvingly, "and real maternal instinct. Those children are lucky to have found you." Judge Hartwell arrived that afternoon, ostensibly to check on their welfare, but clearly wanting to hear the story firsthand. As Alice recounted the events, she noticed how his weathered face grew thoughtful. "Funny thing about family," he said when she finished. "Sometimes blood relatives will stand by and watch you struggle, but sometimes strangers will risk everything to keep you safe." His eyes grew distant, as if he were remembering something painful. "Real family isn't always the one you're born into, Mrs. Carlyle. Sometimes it's the one that chooses you." That evening, as Alice tucked Thomas into bed, the little boy looked up at her with complete trust in his eyes. "Are you really going to stay forever?" he asked. "As long as you'll have me," Alice promised, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. "Good," he said sleepily, "because I think Ma would have really liked you. And I think she would want us to love you too." As Alice kissed his forehead and whispered goodnight, she realized that something fundamental had changed in their small household. The wolf attack had been terrifying, but it had also been a test of her courage, her commitment, and her growing love for these children who were becoming truly hers. When she emerged from the children's room, she found Bram waiting by the fireplace, whittling a small wooden figure. He looked up as she approached, and in his eyes she saw a warmth that hadn't been there before. "Thank you," he said simply, "for protecting them, for staying, for becoming the mother they needed." Alice felt her cheeks warm, but she met his gaze steadily. "They're easy children to love," she replied. "And this is my home now too." As she said the words, Alice realized they were completely true. Somewhere in the space of a week, this mountain clearing and these people had become more of a home than anywhere she'd ever lived. And she would fight to protect it, just as fiercely as she'd fought off those wolves. In the weeks following the wolf attack, Alice found herself settling into mountain life with a naturalness that surprised everyone, including herself. The rhythm of frontier living, rising before dawn, tending animals, preserving food for winter, felt less like hardship and more like purpose. Each morning she would wake to find frost covering her small cabin's windows in delicate patterns, and she began to appreciate the stark beauty of approaching winter rather than fearing it. Bram proved to be a patient teacher, showing her how to smoke meat properly, how to read the signs that predicted weather changes, and how to handle the temperamental milk cow they called Bessie. His hands would cover hers as he demonstrated the proper way to grip an axe handle or adjust the tension on a snare, and Alice found herself becoming acutely aware of his gentle strength and the way he smelled of pine sap and honest work. "You're a quick learner," he told her one afternoon, as she successfully repaired a section of fence that had been damaged by a fallen branch. "Most folks from town take months to get comfortable with mountain ways." Alice straightened, wiping sweat from her forehead, despite the cool air. "I suppose I was ready for a different kind of life," she said. "Town never felt quite right to me anyway." And there was something in the way Bram looked at her then, a growing appreciation that went beyond gratitude for her help with the children. Alice felt her pulse quicken under his gaze, but she turned back to her work, uncertain how to navigate these new feelings that seemed to be developing between them. The children, meanwhile, had begun to blossom under Alice's gentle care. Emma's defensive walls were slowly crumbling, replaced by a child's natural curiosity and joy. She had started asking Alice about her life before the mountain, listening with wide eyes to stories about town life and the books Alice had read in her father's small library. "Did you always want to be a mother?" Emma asked one evening, as they worked together to patch a tear in Thomas's favorite shirt. Alice paused, considering how to answer honestly without burdening the child with her own painful history. "I always hoped I might have children to love someday," she said carefully. "I just didn't expect it to happen quite the way it did." "Are you glad it did, even though your family was mean to you?" The directness of children never ceased to amaze Alice. "Yes, Emma, I'm very glad, because it brought me to you and Thomas and your father." Emma smiled, the expression transforming her serious face. "I'm glad too. Thomas has been laughing more since you came, and Pa doesn't look so tired all the time." It was true. The lines of constant worry that had etched themselves around Bram's eyes were beginning to soften. He had started lingering longer at the dinner table in the evenings, sharing stories of his own childhood or asking Alice about her thoughts on various matters. Sometimes she would catch him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret, something warmer than mere appreciation, but more cautious than affection. The community's reaction to Alice had also begun to shift in encouraging ways. Mrs. Patterson had become a regular visitor, often bringing books to share or news from the valley below. She had taken to inviting Alice to the occasional women's gathering in town, though Alice was still hesitant to attend. "You shouldn't let a few narrow minds keep you from making friends," Mrs. Patterson urged during one of her visits. "Most folks can see clear enough that you're good for Bram and those children. The rest will come around in time." But not everyone was ready to accept Alice's place in the community. Mrs. Whitmore, the minister's wife, had made several pointed comments about unusual arrangements and proper courtship. Her friend, Mrs. Davidson, was even more direct in her disapproval. "It's unseemly," Alice overheard her saying to another woman outside the general store during her first trip to town since the wedding. "Trading women like livestock. What kind of Christian example does that set for our children?" Alice felt her cheeks burn with shame, but before she could retreat, Judge Hartwell appeared at her elbow. "Mrs. Davidson," he said pleasantly, tipping his hat. "I couldn't help but overhear your concern for Christian examples. I seem to recall reading something in Scripture about welcoming strangers and caring for widows and orphans. Mrs. Carlyle seems to be doing both admirably." The woman's face reddened, but she had no ready response for the judge's gentle rebuke. Alice felt a surge of gratitude for his support, though she noticed something melancholy in his expression as he watched the woman hurry away. "Don't let small minds make you feel small, my dear," he said quietly. "You're building something good on that mountain. That's what matters." As they walked together toward the general store, Alice found the courage to ask about the sadness she often glimpsed in his eyes. "Judge Hartwell, if you don't mind my asking, do you have family of your own?" His steps slowed, and for a moment Alice thought he might not answer. "I had a daughter once," he said finally. Catherine. She made a choice I couldn't accept, and I made the mistake of choosing my pride over my love for her. Haven't seen her in 15 years. I'm sorry, Alice said softly. That must be very painful. It is. But watching you with those children, seeing how love can grow where it's planted with care rather than blood, it's made me think perhaps it's not too late to make different choices. That evening, Alice shared the conversation with Bram as they sat by the fire, while the children played a quiet game of checkers nearby. To her surprise, Bram's expression grew thoughtful rather than dismissive. "Hartwell's a good man who made a hard mistake," he said, adjusting the piece of wood he was carving, a small horse that Thomas had requested. "Pride's a poison that can kill love if you let it fester too long." Alice found herself studying Bram's profile in the firelight, noting the strong line of his jaw and the gentle way his large hands shaped the delicate wooden figure. "Have you ever struggled with pride?" Bram was quiet for so long that Alice thought he might not answer. When he spoke, his voice was lower, more intimate. "I was proud when Margaret died, too proud to ask for help, too proud to admit I was drowning trying to raise 2 children alone. Figured I had to prove I could manage everything myself." "What? Changed your mind?" He looked up from his carving to meet her eyes directly. "Watching Emma try to be a grown woman at 9 years old, seeing Thomas go days without speaking because he was afraid of being too much trouble, I realized my pride was hurting the people I loved most. And now," a small smile tugged at the corner of Bram's mouth, "now I'm grateful every day that you're here, that I swallowed my pride enough to accept Judge Hartwell's suggestion about finding a wife, that you were brave enough to make the best of an arrangement that couldn't have been easy for you." Warmth in his voice made Alice's heart race, but before she could respond, Thomas appeared at her knee with a book in his hands. "Will you read to us?" he asked, settling comfortably against her side. Emma quickly joined them, curling up on Alice's other side with her mending. As Alice opened the book and began to read, she was acutely aware of Bram's gaze on her face. The story was a familiar fairy tale, but tonight it felt different, like a promise of possibilities she had never dared to imagine. Here in this warm cabin, surrounded by the gentle sounds of family life, Alice began to believe that her own story might have the kind of ending she had only read about in books. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, blanketing the mountain in pristine white. Inside, Alice read on, her voice steady and warm, while 3 hearts that had known loss began to learn the careful rhythms of love growing slowly but surely in the spaces between them. The first heavy snowfall of winter brought with it an unexpected crisis that would test everything Alice had learned about mountain life and motherhood. She woke before dawn to the sound of Thomas coughing, not the ordinary cough of a child with a cold, but something deeper and more alarming that made her bolt upright in her narrow bed. Wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, Alice hurried across the clearing to the main cabin. Inside, she found Emma sitting beside Thomas's bed, her small face pale with worry in the lamplight. The little boy was burning with fever, his breathing labored and shallow. "How long has he been like this?" Alice asked, pressing her hand to Thomas's forehead and feeling her heart sink at the heat radiating from his skin. "He started coughing yesterday, but it got worse in the night," Emma whispered. "I didn't want to wake Pa because he was so tired, but I'm scared, Alice. He sounds like Ma did before." She couldn't finish the sentence, but Alice understood. Margaret had died from complications after childbirth, and Emma's young mind had linked illness with loss. Bram emerged from his room, already reaching for his clothes. One look at his son's condition told him everything he needed to know. "I'll ride for Dr. Morrison," he said, his voice steady despite the worry in his eyes. In this snow, Alice looked toward the window, where she could see the blizzard still raging. "Bram, you'll never make it down the mountain safely." "I have to try." "No." Alice's voice was firm, surprising them both with its authority. "Thomas needs you here, and Emma needs you safe. I can manage this." For a moment, Bram looked ready to argue, but something in Alice's demeanor stopped him. She moved with quiet efficiency, gathering supplies and issuing gentle instructions to Emma. This wasn't the uncertain woman who had arrived on his doorstep weeks ago. This was someone who had found her strength and wasn't afraid to use it. Alice had learned basic healing skills from her mother. Knowledge that had seemed almost useless in her stepmother's household, but now proved invaluable. She prepared a steam tent using heated water and pine needles to help Thomas breathe more easily. She brewed willow bark tea to bring down his fever and made a mustard plaster for his chest. "Emma, I need you to help me," Alice said, her voice calm and reassuring. "Can you keep the fire going while I tend to Thomas? And talk to him, tell him stories. Sometimes sick people can hear us even when they can't respond." Emma nodded solemnly, taking on the responsibility with the seriousness of someone much older. Bram hovered nearby, his large hands feeling helpless in the face of his son's illness. "What can I do?" he asked Alice quietly. "Pray," she replied simply, "and trust me to care for him." The next 24 hours passed in a blur of treatments and vigilant watching. Alice barely left Thomas's side, monitoring his breathing, adjusting his position to help him rest more comfortably, and forcing small sips of healing broth between his lips whenever he was conscious enough to swallow. During the worst moments, when Thomas's fever spiked and his breathing became even more labored, Alice found herself pouring out desperate prayers to a God she wasn't always sure was listening. But she never let her fear show to the children. Instead, she maintained a steady presence, her hands gentle but sure, as she cared for the little boy who had become so precious to her. Bram watched her work with growing amazement and admiration. This woman who had been deemed worthless by her own family was proving herself to be exactly what his children needed. She anticipated Thomas's needs before he could express them, knew instinctively how to comfort him, and somehow managed to reassure Emma while never leaving her patient's side. "You should rest," he told her during the second night when he found her still awake, bathing Thomas's forehead with cool water. "I'm fine," Alice replied, though exhaustion was evident in every line of her body. "Alice," Bram's voice was gentle but firm, "you've been awake for 2 days. You're no good to him if you collapse." She looked up at him then, and he saw the tears she'd been holding back finally threatening to spill over. "I can't lose him, Bram. I love him. I love them both so much, and if something happened because I wasn't good enough—" "Stop." Bram knelt beside her chair and took her hands in his. "You're not just good enough, Alice. You're everything they need. Everything I never dared to hope for when I agreed to this arrangement." The tenderness in his voice, the warmth of his touch, nearly undid her completely. Alice felt herself leaning into his strength, accepting comfort she hadn't known she desperately needed. "Sleep for a few hours," he said softly. "I'll watch over him. I promise I'll wake you if anything changes." Alice nodded reluctantly, trusting him with the child who had become her own. She curled up on the small cot Emma usually used when she wanted to be near her brother, and fell into an exhausted sleep. When she woke 3 hours later, it was to the sound of Thomas's voice, weak but clear, asking for water. His fever had finally broken, leaving him pale and tired, but undeniably better. Alice sat up quickly, her heart soaring with relief and gratitude. "Mama Alice," Thomas said when he saw her, his small voice scratchy from coughing. "I dreamed you were singing to me." Alice's throat tightened with emotion. He had called her Mama Alice, not just Alice, but Mama. "I was singing, sweetheart. You could hear me? It made me feel better," he said, reaching for her hand. "Even when I felt really sick, I knew you were taking care of me." Emma, who had been dozing in a chair nearby, woke at the sound of voices and immediately rushed to her brother's side. "Thomas, are you really better?" "I think so," he said with a weak smile. "I'm hungry," Alice laughed through her tears. A sick child asking for food was always a good sign. "I'll make you some broth," she said, kissing his forehead gently. As she moved to prepare food for the recovering boy, Bram followed her to the kitchen area. "Alice," he said quietly, "what you did these past few days, I don't have words for it." "You saved him, we saved him," she corrected. "All of us together." "No," Bram said, reaching out to gently touch her cheek. "You saved all of us, me included." The moments stretched between them, filled with unspoken feelings and growing recognition of what they were becoming to each other. Before either could find words for the emotions building between them, they were interrupted by the sound of horses approaching through the melting snow. Looking out the window, Alice saw Dr. Morrison arriving with Judge Hartwell and Mrs. Patterson. The storm had finally cleared enough for travel, and word of Thomas's illness had somehow reached the valley below. "Looks like the cavalry has arrived," Bram said with a gentle smile. "Though the crisis is past, thanks to you." As Alice prepared to welcome their concerned neighbors and accept their praise for her handling of the emergency, she felt a profound shift in her understanding of her place in this family and community. She was no longer the woman who had been traded away because she was deemed worthless. She was Mama Alice, the woman who had fought for a child's life and won. She was the heart of this mountain home, and everyone, including herself, finally knew it. The pressed wildflowers she had been collecting and preserving sat in their small vases around the cabin, bringing touches of color and beauty to the rough-hewn walls. Like those flowers, Alice had taken root in this place, finding a way to bloom even in the harsh conditions of mountain life. And like them, she had become an essential part of the home's warmth and beauty, no longer a stranger or a convenience, but truly and completely family. By the time spring arrived in the Montana mountains, Alice had truly become the heart of the Carlisle household. The crisis of Thomas's illness had cemented her role not just as caretaker, but as the children's beloved mother in every way that mattered. Emma now sought Alice's advice on everything from arithmetic problems to the mysterious changes beginning to happen to her 9-year-old body. Thomas had taken to calling her simply Mama, dropping the qualifying. Alice, as if there had never been any question about her place in his life, the transformation in their family. Dynamic was most evident during the quiet evening hours when they gathered around the fireplace. Thomas would curl against Alice's side while she read aloud, his complete trust in her protection absolute. Emma had begun sharing her own stories and dreams, speaking of her hopes to become a teacher like Mrs. Patterson someday. And Bram, Alice found herself stealing glances at him more often now, noting the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled at something the children said, or how his large hands moved with surprising gentleness when he carved small toys during these peaceful moments. The growing connection between Alice and Bram had become impossible to ignore, though neither had spoken directly about the feelings developing between them. There were moments when their hands would brush as they worked together, or when she would catch him watching her with an expression that made her pulse quicken. The separate cabins that had once seemed like a thoughtful accommodation now felt like an unnecessary barrier. It was during one of these spring evenings that their carefully maintained distance finally began to crumble. Emma had written her first school essay for Mrs. Patterson, a piece about my family that she wanted to share with everyone before submission. "My family is different from other families," Emma read aloud, her voice clear and confident. "My first mother died when I was 6, and for a long time it was just Papa and Thomas and me. We were sad and didn't know how to be happy anymore. Then Mama Alice came to live with us. Some people say she's not our real mother because she didn't give birth to us, but that's not true. Real mothers are the ones who take care of you when you're sick, who read you stories every night, and who love you even when you're being difficult. Mama Alice does all those things. She makes our house feel like a home again. Papa smiles more now, and Thomas laughs every day. I think my first mother would be happy that we have Mama Alice to love us. Family isn't just about being born together. Sometimes it's about choosing to love each other and making that choice every single day." The silence that followed Emma's reading was profound. Alice felt tears streaming down her cheeks, overwhelmed by the beautiful simplicity of the child's understanding. When she looked at Bram, she saw her own emotional reaction mirrored in his face. "Emma," Alice said when she could trust her voice, "that's the most beautiful thing anyone has ever written about me." "It's true," Thomas added seriously. "You're the best mama ever." Later that evening, after the children had been tucked into bed, Alice and Bram found themselves alone by the dying fire. The essay had created an emotional intimacy between them that could no longer be ignored. "She's right, you know," Bram said quietly, his voice rougher than usual. About what makes a real mother. About you making us a family again. Alice felt her heart racing as he moved closer to where she sat. Bram, I need to tell you something, Alice. This arrangement we made, it stopped being just practical for me weeks ago. Watching you with the children, seeing how you've made this place a home, I've fallen in love with you. Not the grateful kind of love a man feels for someone who helps him. The real kind, the forever kind. Alice's breath caught. She had hoped for these words, but hadn't dared to expect them. I love you too, she whispered. I have for longer than I probably should admit. When Bram reached for her hand, Alice didn't pull away. When he leaned closer, she met him halfway. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, full of the careful hope of two people who had both known loss and were afraid to risk their hearts again. Will you move into the main cabin? Bram asked against her lips. Be my wife in every way. Help me raise our children properly? Our children, Alice repeated, loving the sound of it. Yes, Bram, yes to all of it. But their moment of perfect happiness was interrupted by the sound of riders approaching at speed. Through the window, they could see torches bobbing in the darkness, too many for a friendly social call. Bram was on his feet immediately, reaching for his rifle. Stay with the children, he told Alice, but she was already moving toward their bedroom to make sure they were safe. The riders proved to be a group of men from the valley below, led by Sheriff Coleman and including several local ranchers. Their faces were grim in the torchlight, and Alice felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool spring air. Evening, Bram, Sheriff Coleman called out. Sorry to bother you folks so late, but we've got trouble down in the valley. Cattle rustlers hit the Morrison place 2 nights ago, then the Pattersons spread last night. Made off with near 30 head between the 2 properties. Alice watched from the doorway as Bram absorbed this information. Cattle rustling was a serious crime in ranch country, where livestock represented a family's entire livelihood. Losing that many animals could mean financial ruin for the affected families. What can I do to help? Bram asked. Though Alice could see he was already thinking about the vulnerability of their own small homestead. We're organizing patrols, keeping watch on the remaining herds. Figured you ought to know since you're up here alone with the family. These aren't local boys making trouble. This is organized, professional. They know what they're doing and they're armed. The implications were clear. Their peaceful mountain refuge was no longer as safe as it had seemed. Alice thought of the children, sleeping peacefully inside, of the new life they had just committed to building together, and felt a fierce protectiveness rise within her. We'll be careful, she said, stepping into the circle of light. Thank you for the warning. Sheriff Coleman tipped his hat to her respectfully. The events of Thomas's illness had spread throughout the community, cementing Alice's reputation as a capable and devoted mother. Mrs. Carlyle, glad to see you folks are all well. After the men rode away, Alice and Bram stood together in their dooryard, the weight of this new threat settling between them. Their moment of romantic culmination had been replaced by the stark reality that danger was approaching their mountain sanctuary. We'll get through this, Bram said, pulling Alice against his side. Whatever comes, we'll face it together, Alice nodded, drawing strength from his confidence. They had built something precious here, a real family forged from choice rather than blood. She wouldn't let anyone destroy that, no matter what threats emerged from the darkness beyond their clearing. As they secured the cabin for the night, Alice caught sight of the quilt she had been working on during the long winter evenings. Made from scraps of fabric that told the story of their blended family, pieces from Margaret's old dresses, carefully combined with material from Alice's own clothes, it was nearly finished now. Like their family itself, it was something new created from the remnants of what had come before, stronger and more beautiful for the careful combination of different elements. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, Alice and Bram had finally acknowledged what they meant to each other. Whatever came next, they would face it not as 2 separate people bound by convenience, but as partners who had chosen love over fear, family over isolation, and hope over the shadows of their past. The morning after Alice moved her belongings from the small cabin into the main house marked the beginning of what should have been the happiest period of their lives together. Waking up beside Bram, feeling his arm draped protectively around her waist, Alice experienced a contentment she had never imagined possible. The children had accepted the change with the easy adaptability of youth. Though Emma had made a point of telling Alice how glad she was that they were finally a real family like other people, but the threat of cattle rustlers cast a shadow over their newfound domestic bliss. Reports continued to filter up from the valley below, more raids, more livestock stolen, and growing evidence that this was indeed an organized operation, with knowledge of local ranch layouts and patrol schedules. The rustlers seemed to move with an intelligence that suggested inside information, striking when ranchers were away from their properties and avoiding the areas where patrols were expected. Bram had joined the informal network of men taking turns watching over the valley's remaining herds, which meant he was often away from the homestead for hours at a time. Alice found herself constantly listening for unusual sounds, checking and rechecking the doors and windows, and keeping the children closer to home than had been their spring custom. It was during one of these tense periods, while Bram was away on patrol duty, that Alice received an unexpected and unwelcome visitor from her past. She was hanging laundry behind the cabin when she heard a horse approaching at a leisurely pace, not the urgent gallop that had characterized recent arrivals. Looking up, she felt her stomach drop with recognition. The rider was her cousin Joshua, her father's nephew, a man she had never liked and had hoped never to see again. Joshua had always harbored resentment toward Alice's branch of the family, feeling that his uncle had received better land in the family settlement than his own father. He was a man who nursed grievances and looked for opportunities to settle perceived scores. "Well, well," Joshua said as he dismounted, his smile cold and calculating. "Look what mountain life has done for little Alice. You're looking remarkably well for a woman who was supposed to be grateful for any roof over her head. What do you want, Joshua?" Alice asked directly, moving closer to the cabin where she could reach the rifle if necessary. "Just wanted to see how my dear cousin was faring in her new arrangement. Word travels, you know. Heard you've made quite the impression on the mountain folk. Playing at being a mother to another woman's children, I'm told." The casual cruelty in his tone made Alice's jaw tighten, but she kept her voice level. "Those children are mine now, in every way that matters. And this is my home. Your home." Joshua laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "Alice, you were traded like a piece of livestock. You're here because no one else wanted you, and this mountain man needed unpaid help with his household. Don't start believing your own fairy tale." Before Alice could respond, Emma appeared in the cabin doorway, having heard the unfamiliar voice. "Mama Alice? Who is this man?" Joshua's eyes sharpened with interest as he took in Emma's unconscious use of the maternal title. "Mama Alice? How touching. Tell me, child, do you know the story of how your new mama came to live here?" "Joshua, stop!" Alice said sharply, moving to place herself between him and Emma. "Oh, but it's such an interesting story," Joshua continued, his voice dripping with false sweetness. "You see, little girl, your papa bought your new mama from her family when they couldn't afford to keep her anymore. She's not here because she loves you. She's here because she had nowhere else to go." Emma's face went pale, and Alice saw the old uncertainty flickering back into the child's eyes. "That's not true," Emma whispered, but there was a question in her voice that broke Alice's heart. "Emma, go inside and stay with Thomas," Alice said firmly. "This man is leaving," but Joshua wasn't finished. "I brought some interesting news, cousin. Your father's had second thoughts about the arrangement. Seems the family's fortunes have improved somewhat, and there's talk of bringing you home, especially since it's become clear that this mountain marriage hasn't produced the results everyone hoped for." Alice felt cold dread settling in her stomach. "What are you talking about? Still no child of your own, is there? Still proving the doctor right about your Barren condition? How long do you think this mountain man will keep you around when it becomes clear you can't give him the sons he needs to work the land? The words hit Alice like physical blows, awakening all her old insecurities and fears. She had been so happy, so secure in her place in this family, that she had almost forgotten the original judgment that had led to her being traded away. "Bram doesn't care about that," she said, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. "All men care about that, Alice. Even mountain men need heirs. Give it time. He'll start looking at you differently. When he realizes you're taking up space that could be filled by a woman who can actually bear him children." The sound of hoofbeats interrupted Joshua's poisonous words. Bram was returning from patrol, and Alice felt a mixture of relief and anxiety as she watched him approach. How would he react to Joshua's presence? Would her cousin's words plant seeds of doubt in Bram's mind about their future together? Bram dismounted and took in the scene with quick intelligence. Alice's pale face, Emma hovering uncertainly in the doorway, and the stranger whose posture suggested confrontation rather than friendly visitation. "I'm Bram Carlyle," he said simply, extending his hand to Joshua with the polite caution of a man prepared for either friendship or trouble. "Joshua Patterson, Alice's cousin," Joshua replied, shaking Bram's hand while his eyes remained calculating. "I was just telling Alice about some developments back home. Family matters, you understand. Any family of Alice's is welcome here," Bram said, though Alice could hear the underlying wariness in his tone. "Though I notice you've upset my wife and daughter. Perhaps you'd like to explain why." The casual way Bram referred to both Alice and Emma as his family, the protective stance he unconsciously adopted, should have reassured Alice completely. But Joshua's words had found their mark, awakening doubts she thought she had conquered. "Just sharing news from home," Joshua said with false innocence. "Alice can tell you all about it after I've gone. I should be getting back. Long ride ahead of me." As Joshua prepared to leave, he leaned close enough to Alice that only she could hear his final words. "Think about it, cousin. A chance to go home to people who understand your limitations, before this mountain fantasy comes crashing down around you." After Joshua rode away, Alice stood frozen in the yard, his poisonous words echoing in her mind. She was dimly aware of Bram speaking to her, of Emma cautiously approaching, but the old fears were roaring back to life with devastating force. What if Joshua was right? What if Bram would eventually want children of his own? What if her inability to bear children would ultimately destroy the happiness they had built together? What if she was fooling herself about belonging here, about being truly wanted and needed? "Alice," Bram said gently, taking her hands in his, "whatever that man said to you, it doesn't matter. You're my wife, the children's mother, and this is your home. Nothing and no one can change that." But even as Alice nodded and tried to smile, Joshua's words continued to poison her thoughts. The seeds of doubt had been planted, and she feared they would be much harder to uproot than the weeds that occasionally threatened her garden. For the first time since the wolf attack, Alice began to question whether she truly belonged on this mountain, whether the love she had found here was strong enough to withstand the tests that seemed to be gathering like storm clouds on the horizon. The weeks following Joshua's visit passed in an uneasy tension that seemed to affect the entire household. Alice found herself second-guessing every interaction, wondering if Bram noticed her continued failure to conceive, if he was beginning to regret their union. Though he remained loving and attentive, she couldn't shake the feeling that Joshua's words had revealed an uncomfortable truth about her situation. It was during this period of uncertainty that Judge Hartwell received the letter that would change everything for multiple families on the mountain. Alice was visiting with Mrs. Patterson in the valley when the judge's housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, came running to fetch her with urgent news. "The judge needs to see you immediately." "Mrs. Carlyle," the elderly woman said, her face flushed with excitement and worry. "It's about your situation, your legal situation. Please come quickly." Alice found Judge Hartwell in his study, holding what appeared to be an official document and wearing an expression of barely controlled anger. On his desk lay an opened letter, its elegant handwriting suggesting it had come from an educated correspondent. "Alice, my dear," he said, rising as she entered. "Please sit down." I have some rather extraordinary news, though I'm not certain whether to call it good or devastating. Alice felt her heart racing as she took the offered chair. What is it? What's happened? Judge Hartwell held up the faded legal document with trembling hands. I received a letter yesterday from my daughter Catherine, the first communication I've had from her in 15 years. But that's not the most shocking part. Catherine is now a legal clerk in Denver, and she's been researching marriage laws as part of her work. When she read about frontier marriage arrangements in my letters, she became concerned about the legality of such unions. Alice felt confused rather than enlightened. I don't understand what this has to do with Alice. Judge Hartwell interrupted gently. Your family never had the legal right to arrange your marriage. You were 22 years old, of sound mind, and not under any legal guardianship. They could no more trade you than they could sell their neighbor's horse. Your marriage to Bram is valid only because you consented to it, not because your family arranged it. The words hit Alice like a physical blow. She stared at the judge in stunned silence, trying to process what he was telling her. I mean your family essentially committed fraud when they accepted payment for arranging your marriage. They had no legal authority to do so. You were a free woman who could have refused the arrangement at any time. They simply never told you that. Alice felt the room spinning around her. All these months, she had believed herself bound by her family's arrangement, grateful for Bram's kindness in treating her well despite her circumstances. But if Judge Hartwell was right, she had never been a purchased wife at all. She had been a free woman who had chosen to marry Bram. She just hadn't known she was choosing. But why didn't you tell me this before? Alice asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Judge Hartwell's face crumpled with regret. Because I didn't know, my dear child. I should have questioned the arrangement more carefully, should have researched the law myself. I was so focused on the practical solution it represented for everyone involved that I never considered the legal implications. It was Catherine's letter that opened my eyes to what had actually happened. Alice stood abruptly, pacing to the window as she tried to absorb this revelation. If she hadn't been legally bound to marry Bram, then everything about their relationship was different than she had believed. Her gratitude, her sense of obligation, her fear that he might someday regret the arrangement, all of it was based on a false understanding of her situation. Does this change anything legally? She asked. About my marriage to Bram? Not at all. You spoke your vows freely, signed the marriage certificate willingly. The fact that you weren't legally bound to do so only makes your choice more meaningful, not less valid. But Alice was thinking beyond the legal implications to something far more troubling. If her family had defrauded Bram by accepting payment for an arrangement they had no right to make, what did that say about their character? And more importantly, what did it say about her cousin Joshua's recent visit and his talk of bringing her home? Judge Hartwell, she said slowly, if my family had no legal right to arrange my marriage, then they certainly have no legal right to claim me back now. Absolutely none whatsoever. You're a married woman, free to make your own choices. No one can force you to return to your family against your will. Alice felt a chill of premonition. But what if they're not planning to ask my permission? Before Judge Hartwell could respond, they were interrupted by the sound of urgent hoofbeats in the courtyard. Through the window, Alice could see Sheriff Coleman dismounting quickly, his face grim with purpose. Judge, the sheriff called as he entered without ceremony. We've got developments in the rustling situation. Bad ones? Alice listened with growing alarm as Sheriff Coleman explained that the rustlers had escalated their operations. They were no longer content with stealing cattle. They had begun threatening family members, demanding that ranchers abandon their properties entirely or face violence against their loved ones. We think they're working with inside information, Sheriff Coleman continued. Someone's been feeding them details about patrol schedules, family routines, property layouts. This isn't just theft anymore. It's organized intimidation, designed to drive people off their land. Alice's blood ran cold as pieces began falling into place in her mind. Joshua's unexpected visit, his knowledge of their family routine, his casual questions about Bram's patrol schedule, his attempts to undermine her confidence in her place here. What if it hadn't been mere family cruelty? What if he had been gathering information? "Sheriff," Alice said urgently, "my cousin Joshua visited our homestead 2 weeks ago. He asked a lot of questions about our daily routines, about when Bram was away from the property. At the time, I thought he was just being nosy, but now—" Judge Hartwell's face darkened with understanding. "Alice, if your family's involved with these rustlers, if they're using the legal confusion about your marriage to justify taking you back—" Then he was interrupted by the sound of multiple horses approaching at speed. All three of them moved to the window and saw a sight that made Alice's heart sink with dread. At least 8 men were riding hard toward the judge's house, and at their head was her father, flanked by Joshua and several men Alice didn't recognize. "They're not here for a social visit," Sheriff Coleman said grimly, his hand moving instinctively to his weapon. Judge Hartwell was already moving toward his gun cabinet. "Alice, get to the back of the house. If this goes badly—" "No," Alice said firmly, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "If they want to try to claim me, they can do it to my face. I'm not hiding from my own family." As the riders dismounted in the courtyard, Alice could see that several of them were armed and carried themselves with the swagger of men, accustomed to taking what they wanted through force. Her father's face was set in lines of stubborn determination, while Joshua wore an expression of vindictive satisfaction. Through the window, Alice heard her father call out, "Judge Hartwell, we've come for Alice. The arrangement was temporary, and we're taking her home where she belongs." "Over my dead body," Judge Hartwell muttered, checking his rifle. "Alice, you don't have to go anywhere with anyone. You're a free woman, and this is still my jurisdiction." Alice felt a strange calm settling over her as she realized that everything was finally coming into focus. The cattle rustling, the attempts to drive families off their land, her cousin's psychological warfare, and now this aggressive attempt to reclaim her. It was all connected. Her family wasn't just trying to bring her home. They were part of a larger scheme to destabilize the entire mountain community. "Judge," she said quietly, "I think my family and these rustlers are working together. I think they want me back, not because they care about me, but because taking me away from Bram will hurt him and destabilize our community's resistance to their intimidation." As the armed men began moving toward the judge's front door, Alice squared her shoulders and prepared to face the confrontation that would determine not just her own future, but the safety of everyone she had come to love on this mountain. The woman who had once allowed herself to be traded like property was gone forever. In her place stood someone who would fight for her chosen family with everything she had. The plot had finally revealed itself in all its ugly complexity, and Alice was ready to meet it head-on. The confrontation at Judge Hartwell's house erupted with a violence that shattered the mountain's peaceful morning. Alice's father, backed by Joshua and 6 armed men who were clearly more than simple farm hands, demanded entry with the authority of men accustomed to taking what they wanted through force. "Alice!" her father shouted through the locked door. "Stop this foolishness and come home where you belong. This mountain nonsense has gone on long enough." Judge Hartwell positioned himself at the window with his rifle while Sheriff Coleman took up a defensive position by the door. Alice, despite their urgings to stay back, moved to where she could be seen through the glass. "I am home, Pa," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. "I'm exactly where I belong, and I'm not going anywhere with you." "You don't have a choice in the matter," Joshua sneered, stepping forward with an arrogance that made Alice's blood boil. "You're coming back whether you want to or not. We've got business arrangements to consider." "What business arrangements?" Alice demanded, though she was beginning to understand the ugly truth. It was her father who answered, his face flushed with anger and something that might have been shame. "The land that mountain man sits on, it's got value we didn't know about when we made the original arrangement. There's talk of a railroad coming through, mineral rights that could be worth real money. Your husband's been stubborn about selling, but without a wife to worry about, he might be more reasonable. Alice felt sick as the full scope of their plan became clear. You want to force Bram off his land by taking me away from him. And the cattle rustling, that's all part of it, isn't it? Drive out the smaller homesteaders so you and your partners can claim their properties when they abandon them. Smart girl, one of the armed men said with a cold smile. Too smart for her own good. Sheriff Coleman had heard enough. You men are describing criminal conspiracy and extortion. I'm placing you all under arrest. The leader of the armed group laughed harshly. With what army, Sheriff? You're outnumbered and outgunned. Stand aside and let us take the woman and nobody gets hurt. Nobody's taking anyone, Judge Hartwell said firmly, his rifle trained on the group's leader. This is my property, and Mrs. Carlyle is under my protection as a citizen of this county. Alice realized that while this confrontation was escalating toward violence, Bram was still on patrol duty, unaware that danger had come not just to the community, but specifically to his family. Emma and Thomas were at home with Mrs. Patterson, who had been helping with their schoolwork. If her father's group was willing to use force here, they wouldn't hesitate to threaten the children to get what they wanted. I need to get word to Bram, she told Judge Hartwell urgently. If they're willing to do this here, they'll go after the children next. Judge Hartwell nodded grimly. Mrs. Chen, he called to his housekeeper, who had been hovering in the hallway. Take the back stairs to the attic. There's a signal mirror up there. 3 flashes toward the Patterson place to warn them. Then continuous flashing toward the north ridge where the patrol should be. As Mrs. Chen hurried to carry out these instructions, the standoff in the front yard grew more tense. Alice's father was clearly having second thoughts about the violent turn the confrontation had taken. But Joshua and the hired gunman showed no such hesitation. Last chance. Old man, the leader called to Judge Hartwell. Send the woman out or we come in and take her. Alice made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. I'll come out, she announced, moving toward the door, despite the shocked protests of both Judge Hartwell and Sheriff Coleman. Alice, no, Judge Hartwell said urgently. You don't have to do this. Yes, I do, Alice replied, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. Because I'm not going to cower inside while they threaten everyone I care about. And because it's time my father heard some truths he's been avoiding. Alice stepped onto the front porch, her hands visible and empty, but her spine straight with determination. The morning sun illuminated her face, showing the strength that had grown in her during her months on the mountain. Pa, she said, looking directly at her father. Look at me. Really look at me. Do I look like someone who needs rescuing? Her father's expression wavered slightly as he took in her appearance. Alice stood with confidence she had never possessed in his house, her face glowing with health and purpose, her eyes bright with the love she had found and the family she had built. You look well enough, he admitted grudgingly. But that doesn't change the business we need to conduct. What business? The business of stealing other people's land, of terrorizing families and driving them from their homes, or just the business of using me as a tool to hurt the man I love. Joshua stepped forward impatiently. Enough talk. We're taking her now. But before anyone could move, the sound of galloping horses echoed from multiple directions. Mrs. Chen's mirror signals had worked. Bram was approaching from the north with 3 other men from the patrol, while Mrs. Patterson could be seen riding hard from the south. Her face grim with purpose, Alice felt a surge of relief and terror as she saw Bram's familiar figure urging his horse toward them at dangerous speed. His grandfather's rifle, a family heirloom that had protected 3 generations of Carlisle men, was already in his hands, and his face bore an expression of deadly determination. Bram, no! Alice called out, fearing that his arrival would trigger the violence everyone had been trying to avoid. They're armed! But Bram was beyond caution. The sight of armed men threatening his wife had awakened something primal and protective that overrode every other consideration. He dismounted while his horse was still moving and strode into the yard with the confident gait of a man who had no intention of backing down. Gentlemen, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the tense silence, I believe you have something that belongs to me. She doesn't belong to you, Joshua snarled. She belongs to her family, and we're taking her home. She belongs to herself, Bram replied, his eyes never leaving the armed group's leader. And she chose to be my wife. That makes anyone who threatens her my enemy. The leader of the gunmen was clearly growing impatient with the talking. Enough. Boys, take the woman. Kill anyone who gets in the way. But as the men reached for their weapons, Alice made a choice that would be talked about in the mountain community for years to come. Instead of cowering or running, she stepped directly into the line of fire. "Stop!" she commanded, her voice ringing with an authority that made everyone freeze.
"You want me?"
"Fine, but first you're going to hear what I have to say." Alice turned to face her father, ignoring the guns trained on her. "Pa, you sold me once because you said I was worthless. You told me I was barren, useless, a burden you couldn't afford to keep. Well, look around you. Look at the people who are willing to fight for me, willing to risk their lives to keep me safe. Look at my husband, who built me a home with his own hands. Look at the children who call me mother. Look at Judge Hartwell and Sheriff Coleman, who are protecting me, even though we've only known each other a few months." Tears were streaming down her face now, but her voice remained strong. "I found a family that values me, Pa. I found people who see my worth. And if you take me away from them, you won't be saving me. You'll be destroying the only real happiness I've ever known." Her father's face had gone pale, and Alice could see the first cracks appearing in his resolve. But Joshua had no such weaknesses. "Touching," he said sarcastically. "But business is business. Take her!" The moment the gunmen began to move, all hell broke loose. Bram's rifle cracked, dropping the first man who reached for Alice. Judge Hartwell's shot took down another from the window. Sheriff Coleman emerged from the house with his weapon drawn, while the men from the patrol spread out to provide covering fire. But Alice was no longer content to be a prize fought over by others. As chaos erupted around her, she dove for the dropped weapon of the first fallen gunman. If this was going to be a fight for her freedom and her family's safety, she was going to be more than just a bystander. The battle for Alice's freedom and for the future of their mountain community had finally begun in earnest. And for the first time in her life, Alice was fighting for herself rather than simply enduring what others decided for her. The gunfight erupted with the sudden violence of a summer thunderstorm, shattering the morning peace of Judge Hartwell's quiet courtyard. Alice dove behind a wooden water trough as bullets splintered the porch where she had been standing moments before. Her hands shook as she gripped the fallen gunman's weapon, a heavy Colt revolver that felt foreign in her grasp, but her resolve remained steady. Bram had taken cover behind his horse, using the animal's bulk as a shield while returning fire with methodical precision. Each shot from his grandfather's rifle found its mark, and Alice could see why the weapon had protected 3 generations of Carlisle men. There was something almost ceremonial in the way Bram handled it, as if the rifle carried the weight of family honor along with its deadly payload. "Alice," Bram called across the chaos. "Stay down! Don't try to be a hero." But Alice was beyond following orders, even from the man she loved. As one of the remaining gunmen tried to flank Judge Hartwell's position, she raised the heavy pistol with both hands, the way she had seen Bram teach Emma to hold a rifle for target practice. The weapon bucked violently in her grip when she pulled the trigger, but her shot went wide. Striking the wooden fence post inches from her target, the gunman spun toward her, his own weapon raised, and Alice felt time slow to a crawl. This was the moment that would define everything. Would she freeze in fear, or would she fight for the family she had chosen? In that suspended instant, she thought of Thomas calling her Mama, with complete trust. Of Emma's essay about what makes a real mother. Of the home Bram had built for her with his own hands. The gunman's finger tightened on his trigger just as a kitchen knife flew through the air with deadly accuracy, burying itself in his shoulder and spinning him away from Alice. She turned in amazement to see Mrs. Chen standing in the judge's doorway, her elderly face set in lines of fierce determination. "Nobody threatens my judge's guests in my house," the old woman declared. already reaching for another blade from the collection at her belt. The unexpected intervention gave Sheriff Coleman the opening he needed. His shot dropped the wounded gunman permanently, while Judge Hartwell's rifle accounted for another of the attackers. But Joshua and her father had taken cover behind their horses, along with 2 remaining hired guns who showed no inclination to retreat. "This is madness!" Alice's father shouted from behind his makeshift barricade. "Alice, stop this foolishness and come home! People are dying because of your stubbornness." The accusation hit Alice like a physical blow, awakening all her old guilt and self-doubt. For a moment she wavered, wondering if her father was right. Was she responsible for this violence? Should she surrender herself to end the bloodshed? But then she heard Emma's voice, high and clear, cutting through the gunfire like a bell. "Mama Alice, don't let them take you. We need you." Alice turned to see Emma and Thomas standing with Mrs. Patterson at the edge of the courtyard, having arrived despite orders to stay safely away. The sight of her children, for that's what they truly were, regardless of blood, standing there with faith and love shining in their young faces, erased any remaining doubt from Alice's mind. "I am home," she shouted back to her father, her voice carrying clearly across the battlefield. "These people are my family now. This is where I belong." To prove her point, Alice rose from behind the water trough and fired again, this time with steady hands and clear purpose. Her shot shattered the wheel of the wagon Joshua was using for cover, sending him scrambling for a new position. Bram saw her exposure and moved immediately to provide covering fire, but not before one of the remaining gunmen got a clear shot at Alice. The bullet whined past her head, so close she felt the heat of its passage, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she calmly reloaded the heavy pistol, her movements growing more confident with each passing moment. Judge Hartwell, watching from his window, felt a surge of pride at the transformation he was witnessing. This was no longer the frightened woman who had been traded away by her family. This was someone who had found her strength and was willing to use it to protect what mattered most to her. The tide of the battle shifted decisively when Bram managed to work his way around to Joshua's flank. His grandfather's rifle spoke once more, and Joshua dropped with a cry of pain, clutching his leg where Bram's bullet had found its mark. "Enough!" Alice's father called out, his voice cracking with desperation. "I surrender. Stop shooting!" But the remaining hired guns had no intention of giving up so easily. They had been paid to complete a job, and the kind of men who took such work didn't abandon it simply because their employer had lost his nerve. They opened fire with renewed intensity, forcing everyone to dive for cover as bullets flew in every direction. It was then that Alice realized the true test of her courage was yet to come. One of the gunmen had broken from cover and was advancing directly on the children, using their presence to shield his approach toward Judge Hartwell's house. Emma and Thomas stood frozen with terror as the armed man bore down on them, his weapon raised and ready. Without hesitation, Alice abandoned her own cover and ran directly into the line of fire, placing herself between the gunman and the children she had sworn to protect. This was the moment that would define not just her own fate, but the future of everyone she loved. Alice's desperate sprint across the open courtyard felt like the longest journey of her life. Behind her, she could hear Bram shouting her name with a mixture of terror and admiration. Ahead of her, the gunman's weapon was swinging toward Emma and Thomas, who stood frozen in the face of approaching death. Time seemed to stretch like taffy as Alice threw herself between the children and their attacker. She felt the impact of the bullet before she heard the gunshot, a burning sensation that sent her spinning to the ground even as she managed to shield Emma and Thomas with her body. "Mama Alice!" Thomas screamed, dropping to his knees beside her as blood began to seep through her dress at the shoulder. But Alice wasn't finished fighting. Even as pain clouded her vision, she raised the heavy pistol with her uninjured arm and fired point-blank at the gunman who had dared to threaten her children. Her shot took him center mass, dropping him instantly. The sudden silence that followed was deafening. The last of the hired guns had fallen. Joshua lay wounded and defeated, And Alice's father sat with his hands raised in surrender, his face pale with shock at what his greed had wrought. Bram reached Alice's side in seconds, his strong hands gentle as he examined her wound. "You magnificent, terrifying woman," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "What were you thinking?" "I was thinking they're my children," Alice replied, wincing as he probed the bullet wound. "And no one threatens my children." Emma and Thomas pressed close to her, their small hands touching her face as if to reassure themselves that she was still alive. "Are you going to be all right?" Emma asked, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'll be fine, sweetheart," Alice said firmly, though the pain was making her feel lightheaded. "It takes more than one bullet to stop a mountain woman." Judge Hartwell emerged from his house, carrying his medical supplies and wearing an expression of profound respect. "Mrs. Carlyle, what you just did, putting yourself in harm's way to protect those children, that's the finest example of maternal courage I've ever witnessed." As the judge began cleaning and bandaging Alice's wound, Sheriff Coleman was securing the surviving attackers. Joshua's leg wound would heal, but his spirit seemed broken by the failure of their scheme. Alice's father sat in stunned silence, finally beginning to comprehend the magnitude of what he had lost. "Pa," Alice said, her voice sad but firm as Judge Hartwell worked on her shoulder. "Look around you. Look at what your greed has cost. These people were willing to die for me. Emma and Thomas call me Mama because I've earned that title through love, not blood. Bram built me a home because he saw my worth when you couldn't." Her father's face crumpled, and for the first time since her mother's death, Alice saw genuine remorse in his eyes. "Alice, I never meant for it to go this far. When Joshua came with his plans about the land values, about the railroad, I thought I was doing what was best for the family." "Whose family, Pa?" "Because I'm looking at mine right now." As if to emphasize her point, Mrs. Patterson approached with a small object in her hands, a simple gold wedding ring, newly forged by the town blacksmith. "I thought you might want this," she said with a gentle smile. "A proper wedding ring for a woman who's proven herself the finest wife and mother in the territory." Bram took the ring with hands that trembled slightly, then looked into Alice's eyes as he slipped it onto her finger beside the original band he had given her on their wedding day. "Alice Carlyle," he said formally, "will you marry me again? Not because of any arrangement or necessity, but because I love you more than life itself." "Yes," Alice whispered, her heart overflowing despite the pain in her shoulder. Today, tomorrow, and every day after that, the community that had gathered to witness the confrontation now stood witness to something even more remarkable, the public declaration of a love that had grown from practical arrangement into something profound and unshakable. Judge Hartwell cleared his throat ceremoniously. "By the authority vested in me by the territory of Montana and in the presence of these witnesses, I now pronounce you husband and wife again, and this time everyone knows exactly what that means." Emma and Thomas cheered despite their recent terror, while Mrs. Patterson dabbed at her eyes with her handkerchief. Even some of the men from the patrol were grinning broadly at the unexpected wedding ceremony taking place in the aftermath of a gunfight. But perhaps the most profound moment came when Alice's father approached slowly, his hat in his hands and his head bowed with shame. "Alice," he said quietly, "I've lost the right to call you daughter, but I want you to know your mother would have been proud of the woman you've become, proud of the family you've built, proud of the courage you've shown. I'm sorry it took me seeing you willing to die for your children to understand what I threw away when I let you go." Alice studied her father's face for a long moment, seeing genuine regret where once there had been only calculation. "Pa," she said finally, "it's not too late to learn from your mistakes. Judge Hartwell could tell you about second chances with this estranged family." As the community began to disperse and the wounded were tended to, Alice remained surrounded by the people who had chosen to stand with her when everything was on the line. Bram's arm around her uninjured shoulder, Emma and Thomas pressed close to her sides, Judge Hartwell and Mrs. Patterson standing nearby like proud family. Elders, this was what real family looked like. The woman who had once been traded away as worthless, had become the center of a community willing to fight for her. And she had proven herself worthy of their love by being willing to fight and die for them in return. 6 months after the gunfight that had nearly torn their world apart, Alice stood in the doorway of their mountain cabin, watching the late autumn sun paint the peaks in shades of gold and crimson. Her shoulder still ached on cold mornings, a permanent reminder of the day she had chosen to step into gunfire to protect her children. But the scar had become a badge of honor rather than a burden. The changes in their small mountain community had been profound and lasting. With the cattle rustling ring broken and its leaders either dead or imprisoned, the valley had returned to peaceful prosperity. The threatened families had stayed on their land, and new settlers had arrived, drawn by stories of a community that stood together against outside threats. Judge Hartwell had received a second letter from his daughter Catherine, this one responding to his own carefully crafted message about second chances and the families we choose versus the ones we're born into. She would be arriving for Christmas, bringing her own family to meet the father she had been estranged from for 15 years. The old judge's face had regained a lightness that Alice hadn't seen since their first meeting, and he had thrown himself into preparing his house for the reunion with the enthusiasm of a man given an unexpected gift. Sometimes, he had told Alice just the week before, it takes watching someone else's courage to find your own. You taught an old fool that pride makes a cold companion compared to forgiveness. Alice's own father had returned to his homestead a changed man. The conspiracy trial had revealed the full extent of the land speculation scheme that had driven the cattle rustling, and while he had cooperated with authorities to avoid prison, the shame of his actions had transformed him. He had written to Alice twice, letters full of genuine remorse and requests not for forgiveness, but simply for the chance to know the woman his daughter had become. Alice had answered both letters, cautiously but kindly, leaving the door open for a relationship built on respect rather than obligation. Joshua had received a prison sentence that would keep him away from decent people for many years to come. Alice felt no satisfaction in his fate, only sadness for the bitterness that had consumed him, and gratitude that he could no longer hurt anyone she loved. The sound of laughter drew Alice's attention back to the present moment. In the clearing before their cabin, Bram was teaching Thomas how to properly split kindling, his large hands guiding small ones in the rhythm of the axe. The 6-year-old, nearly 7 now, had grown strong and confident under his father's patient guidance, though he still sought Alice's comfort when the nightmares occasionally returned. Emma sat nearby, carefully stitching a new dress for the rag doll that had become Thomas's gift to Alice so many months ago. At 10 years old, Emma was becoming a young lady, but she still curled up against Alice's side every evening for story time, and still called her Mama with the complete trust of a child who had never known anything but love and security from the woman who had chosen to be her mother. "Mama Alice," Thomas called out, holding up a perfectly split piece of kindling for her approval. "Did I do it right?" "Perfect, sweetheart," Alice called back, her heart still warming every time she heard that precious title. "You're getting as good as your papa." Bram looked up at her words, catching her eye across the clearing, and the smile they shared was full of the deep contentment of people who had found their perfect place in the world. Their marriage had grown stronger through every trial, built on a foundation of mutual respect, shared values, and a love that deepened with each passing day. The separate cabin that had once housed Alice now served as a workshop where she had begun, teaching reading and writing to some of the valley children whose families lived too far from the main school. Mrs. Patterson had encouraged this development, recognizing Alice's natural gift for nurturing young minds. The work gave Alice a profound sense of purpose and had helped establish her as one of the community's most respected citizens. On the mantel, inside their cabin, sat a family portrait photograph, the artifact that captured their story's completion. The formal pose couldn't quite contain the joy that radiated from their faces. Bram's hand on Alice's shoulder, Emma and Thomas standing proudly beside their parents, all of them dressed in their finest clothes, but unable to suppress the happiness that made them glow, even in the sepia tones of the photograph. Looking at that image, no one would ever guess that this family had been formed through arrangement rather than birth. The love that bound them together was as real and strong as any family that had ever existed. Proof that the heart recognizes no difference between chosen love and inherited bonds. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, Alice made her way to the family quilt she had finally completed, the one made from scraps of Margaret's dresses and her own clothes, carefully stitched together into something beautiful and entirely new. She spread it on their bed each night, a tangible reminder that families, like quilts, could be made from pieces that had never been meant to go together but created something stronger and more beautiful when combined with care and love. The pressed wildflowers that had brightened their cabin through the long winter months were now joined by autumn bouquets that Emma gathered from the meadows. Like those flowers, Alice had learned to bloom where she was planted, finding beauty and purpose in ground that had once seemed barren. As her family gathered for their evening meal, Alice offered a silent prayer of gratitude for the journey that had brought her here. She had begun as a woman her own family deemed worthless, had been traded like property to a stranger, and had found herself caring for children who weren't born to her. But she had discovered that worth isn't determined by others' judgment, that love isn't limited by blood ties, and that the strongest families are often the ones built by choice rather than chance. The mountain winds carried the sounds of their evening, Emma reading aloud from her favorite book, Thomas's delighted giggles at something his father had whispered, Bram's deep voice joining Alice's in a familiar hymn as they cleaned up after dinner. These were the sounds of home, of family, of a life built on the radical idea that love is stronger than biology, that commitment matters more than circumstances, and that sometimes the family that saves you is the one you never expected to find. In the gathering twilight of their mountain refuge, Alice Carlyle was exactly where she belonged.